He carried Vietnam's nightmares for 40 years, then became the therapist who saves other veterans. Dr. Robert Chen had been running from ghosts since 1971, flashbacks that hit without warning, nightmares that woke him screaming, survivor's guilt that whispered he should have died instead of the brothers who didn't make it home. For 4 decades, he buried those demons under work, under silence, under the belief that asking for help meant admitting weakness, until the day his own darkness nearly consumed him, and he discovered that healing wasn't just possible, it was his calling. Welcome to One Human One Story. Before we tell this incredible story, have you ever wondered about the counselor helping you through your darkest moments and what battles they might have fought to understand your pain? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. Robert Chen was 19 years old when he stepped off the transport plane at Tan Son Nhut Air Base in Saigon, January 15, 1970. Fresh-faced kid from San Francisco's Chinatown, first-generation American, parents who had fled China and built a new life through hard work and sacrifice. Robert was their pride, their hope for the American dream. He was also the first person in his family to serve in the United States military. Robert had volunteered for the Army, not out of patriotic fever, but out of necessity. College deferments were ending. The draft was calling. Better to enlist and have some control over his destiny than wait to be selected. Better to serve with purpose than serve with resentment. Robert chose infantry, chose to be where the action was, chose to matter in a war that most Americans were already questioning. The 25th Infantry Division stationed Robert near Cu Chi, Tunnel Rat territory, the area where Vietnamese fighters had dug an underground city that connected villages for hundreds of miles. American forces spent their days searching for tunnel entrances, their nights listening for sounds of enemy movement below their feet. It was psychological warfare at its most brutal, an invisible enemy that could strike without warning, then disappear into the earth like ghosts. Robert served 13 months in Vietnam, from January 1970 to February 1971. 13 months of patrols through jungle that could hide 1,000 enemies. 13 months of firefights that erupted without warning and ended without resolution. 13 months of losing friends to sniper bullets and booby traps, and the random cruelty of a war that made no sense to the teenagers fighting it. The worst day came on December 8, 1970. Robert's squad was conducting a routine patrol near Tay Ninh when they walked into an ambush. 12 men entered the jungle that morning. 4 came back alive. Robert was one of the survivors. His best friend, Tommy Martinez, was not. Neither was squad leader Sergeant Williams. Neither was the kid from Alabama everyone called Country. Neither was the medic who had saved so many others but couldn't save himself. Robert carried Tommy Martinez's body back to base, 200 yards through hostile territory, while enemy fire erupted around them. Tommy had taken a sniper bullet to the chest, died looking at Robert, died asking Robert to tell his mother he wasn't scared, died with blood in his mouth, and Robert's promise that he would make it home somehow. Robert kept that promise. Tommy Martinez went home in a flag-draped coffin. Robert went home with invisible wounds that would take 40 years to heal. The transition from Vietnam to civilian life was brutal for most veterans. For Robert, it was catastrophic. He arrived at San Francisco International Airport on February 23, 1971, to protesters calling him a baby killer, to a country that wanted to forget the war was happening, to a family that didn't understand why their proud son had returned quiet and angry and broken. Robert tried college, dropped out after 2 semesters, tried work, couldn't hold a job for more than 6 months. The nightmares were constant, the flashbacks unpredictable. Loud noises sent him diving for cover. Crowds made him panic. Sleep was impossible without alcohol or pills. Robert was self-medicating long before he understood what that meant. But Robert was also determined, stubborn, unwilling to surrender to the darkness that had consumed so many of his brothers. In 1975, he enrolled in community college, studied psychology, not because he wanted to understand himself, but because he wanted to understand why people did the things they did to each other, why wars happened, why good men died and broken men survived. Psychology became Robert's lifeline. The academic study of human behavior gave him a framework for understanding trauma without having to confront his own. He could analyze PTSD as a clinical condition without admitting he was suffering from it. He could research survivor's guilt without acknowledging that he woke up every morning wondering why he was alive when better men were dead. Robert earned his bachelor's degree in 1979, his master's in 1982, his doctorate in clinical psychology in 1987. 17 years of education that was really 17 years of hiding, running from Vietnam by burying himself in books and theories and other people's problems. He became an expert on trauma without treating his own, a healer who refused to heal himself. Dr. Robert Chen opened his private practice in 1988, specialized in anxiety disorders and depression, helped hundreds of patients overcome their fears and find meaning in their suffering. But he never treated veterans, never worked with combat trauma, never allowed himself to confront the source of his own pain. That would have required honesty, vulnerability, admitting that the expert needed help. For 30 years, Robert lived two lives. During the day, he was Dr. Chen, respected therapist, caring professional, man who helped others find peace. At night, he was Bobby from the jungle, frightened kid who still heard Tommy Martinez calling his name, still saw Sergeant Williams falling, still smelled the cordite and blood and fear of that December morning in 1970. The breaking point came in 2018. Robert was 67 years old, had been carrying Vietnam for 47 years. His marriage of 35 years was failing. His relationship with his adult children was strained. His health was deteriorating from decades of stress and self-medication. The nightmares were getting worse, the flashbacks more frequent, the survivor's guilt more overwhelming. On Veterans Day 2018, Robert sat in his office staring at a bottle of sleeping pills, calculating dosages, planning his escape from a pain that had become unbearable. He was tired of pretending to be whole, tired of helping others heal while he remained broken, tired of living with ghosts that never aged while he grew old, carrying their weight. That's when his secretary knocked on the door. There was a walk-in patient, Vietnam veteran, homeless, desperate. Would Dr. Chen see him as an emergency case? Robert almost said no. He wasn't taking new patients, especially not veterans, especially not today when his own demons were winning. But something stopped him. Maybe it was professional obligation. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the universe putting the right person in the right place at exactly the right moment. Robert agreed to see the veteran. One session, emergency consultation. Then he would refer him to someone else. The veteran's name was David Martinez, 59 years old, son of the Tommy Martinez who had died in Robert's arms 48 years earlier. David had been searching for years to find someone who knew his father, someone who could tell him about the man who had died when David was 6 months old, someone who could help him understand the nightmares he was having about a war he had never fought. David Martinez had inherited his father's trauma. Second-generation PTSD was real. Children of combat veterans often carried psychological wounds they couldn't explain. David had spent his adult life struggling with anxiety, depression, and survivor's guilt for a survival he had never experienced. He was homeless because he couldn't hold jobs, addicted because he couldn't handle sobriety, broken because he had never learned how to be whole. Robert stared at David Martinez and saw Tommy's eyes, Tommy's smile, Tommy's hands. Sitting across from his desk was the son of the man whose death had defined Robert's life, the child who had grown up without a father because Robert had been unable to save him, the living proof that some wounds never heal, but sometimes they transform into something unexpected. For the first time in 48 years, Robert told the truth about Vietnam, about the ambush, about carrying Tommy Martinez's body through enemy fire, about the promise he had made to a dying friend, about the guilt he had carried for surviving when better men had died, about the nightmares and flashbacks and decades of running from ghosts. David Martinez listened without judgment, without surprise. He had known somehow, had felt his father's presence in his own unexplained trauma, had understood intuitively that his problems were connected to something larger than his own experience. Meeting Robert wasn't just coincidence, it was completion. the circle closing after nearly 5 decades. That session changed both their lives. David Martinez finally understood the source of his inherited trauma. Robert Chen finally confronted the source of his survival guilt. Neither of them was magically healed by the meeting, but both of them began healing for the first time after carrying their respective wounds for 48 years. Robert began his own therapy the following week, prolonged exposure therapy with a specialist in combat trauma. The same treatment he had been trained to provide but had never allowed himself to receive. It was brutal, confronting 48 years of suppressed memories, reliving the worst day of his life in clinical detail, processing survivor's guilt that had been poisoning him for decades. But it worked. Slowly, carefully, Robert began to heal. The nightmares didn't disappear, but they became manageable. The flashbacks didn't stop, but they lost their power to control it. Most importantly, the guilt began to transform. Instead of believing he should have died, instead of Tommy Martinez, Robert began to understand that he had survived for a reason, that his survival had purpose, that helping others heal was how he honored the dead. Robert's personal therapy lasted 2 years. Professional retraining took another year. At 70 years old, he was learning new skills: combat trauma treatment, PTSD protocols, group therapy techniques for veterans. He was becoming the therapist he should have been 40 years earlier, the healer who understood pain because he had survived it. In 2021, Robert Chen opened a new practice, Chen Veterans Counseling Services, specialized treatment for combat trauma and military-related PTSD. His first patient was David Martinez. His second was another Vietnam veteran who had heard about the shrink who actually understood what the jungle did to your soul. Word spread quickly through the veteran community. There was a therapist who got it, who had been there, who could help, because he had needed help too. Robert's practice grew rapidly. Vietnam veterans who had waited 50 years for someone who understood. Iraq and Afghanistan veterans who were fighting battles similar to Robert. Military families dealing with inherited trauma like David Martinez. Suicide prevention cases. Addiction recovery. Marriage counseling for couples torn apart by war's aftermath. What made Robert unique wasn't his credentials or training. It was his authenticity. When a veteran said the nightmares were unbearable, Robert could say, "I know, I had them for 48 years." When someone expressed survivor's guilt, Robert could say, "I carried Tommy Martinez's body and wondered why it wasn't mine." When a patient talked about feeling isolated from civilians who couldn't understand, Robert could say, "I spent 30 years helping other people while refusing to help myself." Robert's patients trusted him because his empathy was earned, not learned. His understanding came from experience, not textbook. His hope was real because he had traveled the same journey from darkness to light. He was proof that healing was possible even after decades of suffering, even when the wounds seemed too deep to address, even when hope seemed impossible to maintain. David Martinez became Robert's success story and his friend. The son of the man whose death had haunted Robert found peace by helping Robert find his own peace. David completed treatment, found stable housing, maintained sobriety, built relationship, discovered that inherited trauma could be healed just like direct trauma, that second-generation wounds were real but not permanent. 3 years later, Robert's practice had grown to include 4 other therapists, all veterans, all trauma survivors, all people who understood that the best healers are often the wounded healers, the ones who have walked through darkness and found light, who can guide others along the same path because they have traveled it themselves. Robert began speaking at veteran conferences, teaching other therapists about trauma treatment, writing articles about the importance of addressing combat PTSD, regardless of how much time has passed. His message was simple but revolutionary. It's never too late to heal. Survival guilt can be transformed into survival purpose. The nightmares can end. The flashbacks can lose their power. Hope is possible, even after decades of despair. In 2024, Robert received the American Psychological Association's Award for Distinguished Professional Contributions to Applied Research, recognition for his work with combat veterans, and his research on delayed treatment for military trauma. Robert accepted the award on behalf of all the veterans who had waited decades for help, all the Tommy Martinezes who didn't make it home, all the David Martinezes who inherited wounds they didn't create. But the moment that mattered most to Robert came 6 months later, during a group therapy session for Vietnam veterans. An old Marine was describing flashbacks from Quezon, talking about guilt for surviving when his squad leader didn't. The room was quiet, heavy, filled with understanding that only combat veterans can share. The Marine finished talking and looked around the circle. His eyes stopped on Robert. "Doc," he said, "I can tell by the way you listen that you've been there, that you understand because you lived it too." Robert nodded. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I lived it too, and I'm still living it. But now I'm living it differently." That was Robert's healing in a single sentence. Still carrying Vietnam, but carrying it differently. Not as a burden, but as a bridge. Not as shame, but as strength. Not as something that had broken him, but as something that had ultimately made him whole in a way he never could have been without the brokenness. Robert Chen retired from active practice in 2024 at the age of 73, but he didn't retire from service. He began training other therapists, mentoring veteran counselors, developing treatment protocols for delayed onset PTSD. His mission had evolved from healing himself to creating systems that could heal others. The nightmares still come sometimes. The flashbacks still happen. Robert still hears Tommy Martinez calling his name on quiet nights when his guard is down. But now, when he hears that voice, he responds differently. Instead of guilt, he feels gratitude. Instead of wondering why he survived, he celebrates that his survival had purpose. Instead of carrying the dead as burdens, he carries them as inspiration. Robert's story spreads through the veteran community like hope itself, proof that it's never too late to heal, that trauma can be transformed, that the wounded healer often becomes the most effective healer, that surviving is not something to feel guilty about, but something to feel grateful for, that carrying the dead means honoring them by living fully. Every veteran who walks into Robert's former practice now sees a plaque on the wall. It reads, "In memory of Sergeant Tommy Martinez and all the brothers who didn't make it home. They live on in the healing we provide to those who did." It's signed simply, Bobby Chen, Vietnam, 1970 to 1971. Survivor, healer, still serving. Robert Chen carried Vietnam's nightmares for 40 years before he learned to transform them into healing for others. His journey from broken veteran to master healer proves that our greatest wounds can become our greatest strength, that survival guilt can become survival purpose, that the people who understand pain the deepest are often the ones who can heal it most effectively. So I ask you, have you ever met someone whose understanding seemed to come from personal experience rather than professional training? Someone whose empathy felt earned rather than learned? Someone who could guide you through darkness because they had walked that path themselves? Tell us about the wounded healers in your life, because here at One Human, One Story, we believe that our scars can become sources of strength for others. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded that healing is possible even after decades of pain. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about people who transform their trauma into triumph. And remember that the therapist or counselor helping you might be fighting battles similar to your own. Sometimes the wounded become the healers, sometimes the broken become the bridge builders, and sometimes the people who carry the most pain become the ones who provide the most hope. Sometimes healing isn't about forgetting what happened. Sometimes it's about remembering differently, not as something that destroyed you, but as something that prepared you to help others heal, not as evidence of your weakness, but as proof of your strength. And sometimes the best way to honor the dead is not by joining them, but by living fully in service to those who still need hope.